I mean, on the one hand side, of course, having a good amount of knowledge in AI is helpful, but I will say it's not the only thing you need, right? By far not. I think you can be the best AI expert in the world, but really driving that with an end-to-end lens requires a lot of other skills as well. It requires a lot of soft skills, right? Communicate clearly, understand the portfolio, understand also the dynamics.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to and watching another episode of The Chief AI Officer. Today I have a very special episode. I'm here with Philipp Herzig, who is Chief AI Officer at SAP. If you don't know SAP, you probably haven't been living in the world of software, but they are one of the biggest providers of enterprise resource planning and many other solutions. Philipp, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Ben. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I've been excited for this one. You scheduled back in March, and it's been a long wait, but I'm very excited to have you here today. You know, you've had a remarkable journey at SAP since 2009. Before we get into AI and how you're operationalizing it across your customers, can you share a bit about your career progression and what initially drew you to SAP?
Oh, sure. Happy to do so. So actually, I'm now, I don't know, 15 years with SAP. And funnily enough, sometimes people ask me, it's my first and only company. It's not entirely true, but I started as a working student already when I was still a master's student back in the days. And well, why did I join SAP? Because it was so close to the university where I studied both master and then PhD. And they also had this amazing program back in the days where I could do a PhD alongside some relevant projects in the industry, which was quite cool. Yeah, but then over the years, I was mostly on the engineering side all the years. So actually, I was more specialized in cloud computing, distributed systems, things like that, and helped over the years to get quite some solutions within SAP, whether it's real estate solutions or configure price quotes or for complex selling complex products, or our health solutions, finance solutions, many of those things. I'm getting them off the ground. And while was specialized all the time more in cloud computing, cloud native programming, these kind of things, AI, I was always like an AI hobbyist on the side, if you will. So always from studies did all my econometrics, statistics, machine learning courses, and also back in the early days when we created the HANA database, and also what is now our new ERP with S/4HANA, created some of the first AI use case for it. So always like on the side, there were some AI projects that we've been driving, and just recently. Well, there's also, I think, a very important part of our strategy when it comes to AI, actually, is the last 3 years I was very busy integrating our solutions. Some listeners may know that SAP was between 2010 and 2020 on this acquisition spree, purchasing a couple of cloud companies. And the last 3 years, we were dramatically busy integrating them from the user experience and from process and how we run all those things on the cloud in a harmonized way. And that helps actually a lot also when it comes now to our AI strategy and really deliver a consistent suite feeling all across our applications and infuse AI in a consistent and coherent fashion in our business apps.
Yeah, that's quite the progression, and sounds like you were always a hobbyist. What drew you to it? Was there something personal, something about AI that really sparked your interest from an early age?
Yeah, it was funny because when I was still in high school, you had these lessons around stochastics, right? So the really the basic stuff like combinatorial theory and so, and I hated it with passion. And I never thought that this would be anywhere a field that I would be later in my life curious about. What caught my attention was actually during my bachelor's, there was a super hard database lecture where only like, I don't know, 10% made it on the first attempt, right? And they're passing the exam. And those who did actually were invited by the professor who ran a little startup. I'm not sure whether it still exists, and they asked then the top 10% of whether they would join this startup and work on something what is still known today as predictive maintenance. So what we essentially did, we had this sheer volumes of data from healthcare companies like Siemens, for example, from MRTs and other devices, unstructured data, structured data, and we try to find out what are the variables, what would be the factors in order to predict whether a machine would go and break, and then rather replace parts in that machine earlier to avoid the downtime of that machine. And that was such a fascinating project back in the days. And all of a sudden, things like you know some of the algorithms we used were like hidden Markov models, support vector machines, and this was the cool stuff back in the days. Still it is. And that really caught my attention, and then I was like all fired up for this, and yeah, since then it was always a hobby, and learned all the things over the years and so on, and yeah, so it was really a fun journey.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, that's a great starting use case, something with a huge impact on the business early on, right? In terms of predictive maintenance of all the shop floor in the factory. SAP obviously very large. You mentioned acquisitions, integrating all of that over, from 2010 to 2020. You have, I think, something like 27,000 customers using some of your AI solutions today, if I'm not mistaken. You're
Correct.
obviously very close to understanding AI in business. How would you summarize the state of enterprise AI today?
Well, it's interesting, right? I think last year in particular was really the phase of experimentation, right? I think all across the world, enterprises tried out what can they really legitimately do with the technology, right? And it has resulted in many POCs, right? And obviously leveraging OpenAI, right? And using technologies from Azure, et cetera, et cetera. But what I really see is still companies at scale, right, struggle to introduce that to their organizations at this point in time. So overall, I would still judge that enterprise adoption in general is still quite low. We see, of course, this tremendous potential, but the reality is what we see is there's still so many challenges, right, that companies need to overcome, because usually the first POC is easy to create, right? You can easily create, I don't know, a chatbot for customer service or some RAG pipeline with some for some information retrieval, right? That is so much better than classical sparse retrieval approaches for the same kind of information you'd like to retrieve. But the reality is then really deploying that in production, taking all these what we usually refer to as enterprise readiness with SOC compliance, GDPR, EU access, getting it done with the right performance, with the right costs, right? All of those qualities you would come to expect. Turns out that it's harder than everybody anticipated it to be. And so what we see is really what we also were very busy, right? Really implementing AI, not just using technology. For sure, we use a lot of technology. We have this open partnership ecosystem, right, with the likes of Google and Amazon and Microsoft and NVIDIA and IBM and many more. But it's really about how can we combine the best of those technologies to create the business outcome within the business processes and the business applications that our users use today, whether it's in HR, whether it's in finance and supply chain, procurement, right? There's so much potential you can lift from either productivity, efficiency, or with Joule from our generative AI Copilot from a user experience perspective, where I see a lot of attention where customers are simply saying, well, if I can use that, right, with the respective enterprise qualities out of the box within these applications, they would go just use it versus just building it themselves, even though that's of course possible. I mean, you can create everything yourself if you know how to use these technologies in the right way. But I really see still it's still from an enterprise adoption perspective in my mind, still day one, as we are figuring out how you can really safely at scale, at the right cost, deploy these solutions in production to really get the benefits. While at the same time, of course, everybody's talking about the next wave already with agents and edge deployment and like all these other cool things, which obviously are on the horizon. So we're somewhere I would describe it in between these two worlds.
Yeah, I agree. I think you touched on two important points that we're also seeing in conversations with our customers. One is a lot of POCs have stalled, right? And because of all you mentioned, a lot of things related to security and data privacy. I think another thing we're seeing is also just accuracy and reliability, right? Like these are not as reliable as formal systems at scale.
Yeah, it's easy if you have just 10 embeddings to retrieve the right documents, but if you have hundreds and thousands of these documents, it becomes a much harder challenge to get the accuracy right. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on the other side as well, I think you mentioned having a big ecosystem at SAP. I think AI is going to be a big shift in the sense that it's no longer always going to be that question of build versus buy internally, and much more a question of build with or build on, because those capabilities are going to be so difficult to develop in-house. And so the ecosystem will be a big part of what drives innovation with customers. I've heard you talk about AI and cloud going hand in hand, and like only 1% of customers deploy on-prem, things like that. Is that also how you see it? Are you seeing a shift towards build with versus what was going on before?
Absolutely. I mean, that is a little bit the challenge, right? In particular, if you look at on-prem, right? For the challenge overall with on-premise deployments is it's not that it's technically not possible to do it, right? But it's much, much harder to get it right because you can only do so much, right? In terms of making assumptions. And, the data model on-premise might be different because people have changed it, right? To whatever they thought 20, 30 years ago is useful. Whether that's still true or not, different question. And so what we said clearly is from a life cycle management, from an automation perspective, and really designing, and this is also how we think about it, really designing the AI capabilities that are available with the click of a button out of the box, right? Based on large pre-trained models. Of course, then still, right, adapted with in-context learning or RAG, right, to a little bit the customer-specific nature of the data. That moves also the needle, right, in terms of adoption. So we always have seen when it's in the cloud and when it can be consumed out of the box, the uptick, right, and adoption is so much higher versus on-prem, where you bake something, right, as a software vendor, you ship it, and then still customers need to set up a project. And it's just, well, it can work. And in particular, if these customers entertain large IT departments, right, maybe even having a couple of data scientists and so on and so forth. But then again, why would you spend these precious data scientists on something in finance or in HR or in procurement, for example, instead of like really, for example, building AI into the real product, like your cars or your other products? I mean, you would first deploy them there to, with AI, improve maybe the user experience or your product in that way, and not like the things, right, where somebody else can take them. So there's this natural conflict, right, on where do you spend your precious people and other resources, and then really get the return on investment, right, on the same thing. So that is where it is possible, but it never really took off from a scalability perspective. If you target like SAP 400,000 customers, right, that run SAP in one way or another. And so these things become really it's more really an economical aspect than a technical at the end of the day.
That makes a lot of sense. I think cloud, obviously, enabling out-of-the-box solutions is a huge driver for business. Would you say that Gen AI really lowering the barrier to entry for people interacting with some of these systems is also a huge driver of innovation in the space right now?
I think so. I mean, obviously, right, these extremely large models, that in their nature, that they have been pre-trained. That was also something we recognized very quickly when it reached that tipping point, that it became very useful, right, with the introduction of GPT 3.5, Turbo, etc. That delivering this experience at scale makes it much, much easier, right? Some say, specifically with large language models, we have again on a next level democratized the access to AI and what you can do with it at scale, hence giving it to more people, right, to do something useful with it. While it's still not to be underestimated, it's still not trivial, right? I mean, there's still a long way to go from zero-shot prompting, simple prompting techniques to, really getting it right for also more complex use cases. But yes, the entry barrier definitely, again, has been lowered, right, compared to the way how we previously, or in the last 10 years we did with deep learning in the years before, right? I still remember when I was a student, we implemented the hidden Markov models out of the research papers ourselves, right? There was just no library available. So yeah, it has definitely lowered the barrier, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the space has come a long way. Obviously, at SAP, you have a lot of projects. You have the HANA vector engine, you have Joule, you have foundational model, not to mention hundreds of other products, I'm sure, related to the AI. What are your top priorities when it comes to advancing AI at SAP? How do you prioritize across so many different things?
Well, we have a very, very clear line to prioritize the thing. So we really start always building. So again, we are not building the technology in the first place. right? So the technology we provide, you just mentioned a couple of them, like they had a cloud vector engine, for example, or our Joule framework, right, which sits on our business technology platform, or our AI core solution, which is kind of or generative AI hub, which is our central layer, right, to access all these various models, whether it's the OpenAI models or the Anthropic models or the Gemini models, or Meta Llama 3, Mistral, what have you. We really focus first and foremost on the application layer. So really introducing the AI capabilities where the users are today, whether those are buttons, right, somewhere in the business process in the UIs that they're using today, or whether it's Joule, right, as a totally new way to interact with the system in natural language, for information retrieval, but also to I refrain from using large action models as a buzz term, but yes, you can do with Joule also transactional workloads, which at the end of the day result in an outcome, right? Like a salary increase for an employee, for example, or a new hire or a job requisition that lands on the job portal, stuff like this. And this is where we really focus on in the first place. And then we think really hard about how do we, because we want to create this suite feeling, right? So Joule is not a Joule for our HR applications or finance applications, right? But it's one Joule, and the more applications you connect into it, the more powerful it becomes, right? And then it really is also a vehicle for us to further drive our integration efforts. So it's really one generative AI copilot. So no matter which application you are, and all of a sudden you have this other, like you want to hire somebody, maybe you're busy with an HR task, and all of a sudden, oh, do I still have budget left? What is my personal expenses saying, which is a finance question? You can do this from within the HR applications as long as our financial system is also connected underneath. And so we can really serve from all the various places. And by this, blur the lines also between lines of businesses in the company, which is huge if you think this to the end. And so from that perspective, we really design these services on the business technology platform out of this necessity, out of these design principles of embedding it in our applications and do it in a consistent fashion so that all of our applications use underneath the same services. And then if customers want to build their own things with it, like, for example, adapting, because every customer wants a slightly different version of what we have thought of in a standard product, and they want to adapt it, right, to their needs, or they want to build their own custom applications because maybe it's something very customer specific or very industry specific where we don't see a good need, right, or a good opportunity for SAP to scale that. Then, of course, customers may also use these technologies to build their own things, and they can do it just exactly in the same way as we do it for our own applications. And as a result, they can do it on a much higher level of productivity than, maybe doing it directly on Azure or even lower down the stack.
Yeah, so interesting because I think that fully integrated suite, we've been talking for a long time in business of the value of data integration, of creating, a single architecture, but different departments never really saw the benefits of that directly. Whereas I think now with these types of copilots, the use cases are expanding in ways that people very quickly see the value because it's so intuitive to interact with. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see, this
100%.
long transformation journey is going to be accelerated very quickly. Obviously, as you build out a fully integrated suite like that, that is inherently a complex thing with so many products. What challenges are you encountering when you're operationalizing that within the products, and what challenges do you see your customers having?
Well, the thing is, we are making very, very quick progress these days, I would say, from infusing AI according to these principles, right, I just outlined. And the good thing is, to be honest, if we wouldn't have done the work on the last 3, 4, 5 years, right, on integrating that, on standardizing on a couple of a common set of services, like for identity management or master data or our user experience and so on and so forth, right? I mean, if you today log into the various SAP applications, look all the same, right? All mobile applications look all the same, and they have been built all with the same frameworks, right? And that makes it, of course, now much easier, right, to introduce simple things like, oh, how do we make sure that every application shows the same disclaimer, right, when you tap the first time as a user into a generative AI capability? How do all the buttons look the same? How does Joule, the chat window, how does this look all the same? Like, that would be much, much harder if we wouldn't have done the work before, and of course also clearly change the strategy in that way, and that makes us so fast. What we see, of course, still on the enterprise side of the house, there's still a lot of these things that we mentioned before. Lots of questions around security, data privacy. Is my data not used, right? All of a sudden I find my business data. We both know that it doesn't happen, that all of my data all of a sudden is in ChatGPT, right? My business data, and people can prompt the consumer version of ChatGPT, and all of a sudden my P&L, my last P&L or my financial data shows up in there. Like all these questions, right? Or identification topics, right? On IP and all the topics we're also discussing, right? In the public media when it comes to all the lawsuits that are going on. So that is, of course, right? These are concerns enterprises all around the world legitimately have. And so that's a lot of the work that we're currently doing with customers, really sitting with them together. And of course, at the same time, figuring out where's really the business value, right? Because some of the cases have smaller values, some are bigger. And then it's a conversation also with the customer to figure out what of these cases have the most value, so that they then start with them and drive the adoption going forward. But overall, I mean, every customer is super excited about it. This is what I see. It's just a matter of time, right? And, working through this new world, right, where everyone, in my mind, needs just to better understand how the things are now working and what's working already, right, with respect to security, for example, and privacy, and what's not yet working, and step by step, working towards the vision and the target picture that most people have in mind.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not jealous of the 10 years you probably spent dealing with technical debt and integrations and making that integrated suite, but now you have that framework in place. You can obviously deliver enormous value to your
I tell
customers.
you, it would have been, otherwise it would have been so much.
Oh, I believe it. You're really building on a strong foundation now, which is amazing. And you mentioned identifying what has the most value with customers. What is that conversation like? How are you helping customers figure out which use cases are going to drive the most value for them?
Well, what we usually do, so two answers to this. So first of all, right, this is already the first answer to this is the product development answer to it, which is we already from the get-go, when we develop these use cases, we think about, we not just introduce Gen AI for the sake of Gen AI or also more classical narrow AI scenarios, but really always with the question in mind, what's in for the customer, right? Where's the value, either in the back office, right, or in the front office applications that we have to help people to achieve more. And then we really sit together. We have a value advisory team, which has a lot of also industry benchmark data and so on and so forth, to really figure out in a certain industry for this line of business, how much would that use case, given certain parameters, employees or revenue or what have you, to figure out what's really in for the customer, right? And then we prioritize also accordingly. So we take those value definitions per use case, and then really in this priority also work against them. And that is obviously very useful, because if we then go to the customer, we have these value calculators. You can think of them like mini pocket calculators, if you will. And then we look at what does the customer has today already in your solution landscape. And many customers of us, right, have many of our solutions deployed. And then we look like, okay, we always then say, like, there's a quick win discussion usually, like what values can we immediately reap and get benefit from? And what are the ones that are still on our roadmap, right? Where then a customer also has clarity around, okay, this is something I don't need to build myself, because anyway, it will come in a standard product, right? So why would I implement my precious resources, to the discussion point earlier, into building it myself, versus just consuming it when it's there in the standard app and the application. And then of course, then we also have then the discussion around the customized AI, right, where then they build their own use cases because it is either not attractive for us to build it, but maybe it's for the customer because it's very specific, very differentiating. And those discussions we run then through what we call discovery workshops. So we go with all these customers, we go into workshops, right, where we then really, with design thinking and other methodologies, try to map the capabilities and the value to either the existing landscape or the future landscape, as customers obviously also are always on the constant journey to transform and reinvent themselves.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think it is a laser focus on creating the most value and then helping customers along in that journey to really better quantify it, but then also to think through, how do you actually implement this that is going to help them the most? You mentioned narrow AI and generative AI, or more traditional AI, right? Are you seeing customers tending to lean too much into Gen AI when there's other far more reliable, like, systems that you could be using for a particular use case? Or do they kind of approach that case by case?
It's an interesting question. I would say yes, there is of course a strong tendency and a strong bias, right, towards Gen AI these days. Also, of course, because it enables scenarios, right, that were impossible before, in particular, right, where you have to deal with lots of text, right, either text as input or text as output or images or other sorts of unstructured data. But at the same time, we really don't care when we produce the products because, sometimes it is more also a classical one, right, where we just, use traditional mechanisms. We have also the privilege, right, that many customers, tens of thousands of customers, have given consent to SAP that we can use their data, right, to produce something which we also use to train narrow AI models. And then maybe sometimes combination thereof, right? So maybe sometimes also combination, specifically in finance, right? Sometimes you need to summarize something, but the question was around maybe a sales forecast or a controlling forecast or some other kind of prediction that you want to do. And of course, we know that, narrow AI models perform much, much better, right, with respect to a certain task, in particular using so it's such classical approaches. And then sometimes it's just also simply a combination of both. And again, the beauty of our strategy is the customer at the end of the day, they don't really care, right? They just want to get this outcome done, want to get the task done. And of course, it's our job, right, to make it as reliable and as accurate as possible in a certain domain and scenario.
Yeah, very true. Customers care about the outcome and less the how. As customers are building out their product portfolio, of AI solutions with SAP, how are you ensuring responsible AI practices? I've read somewhere that obviously there's the EU AI Act. I think I saw that SAP has even stronger ethical best practices in place than were in the EU AI Act. How are you helping customers navigate that?
Well, that's a very, very deep question, right? Because we can probably talk ages about that super important topic, which is really critical to us. And in fact, this whole responsible AI, I mean, now it's all over the place also, right, in the discussion with respect to safety and alignment, right, on large language models and all these questions. But overall, my answer usually to this question is we have established already in 2018 or 17, it was a very comprehensive AI ethics policy, right? Even it was long before, right, where everybody talked about Gen AI and transformer-based architecture in the new world. And because we believed already back then that the technology, right, specifically in AI, will change all the time, right? There will be new tools, will be new algorithms, new approaches, right? Research will find something out, technology vendors will come up with amazing new technologies, and so on and so forth. It will change all the time. But in this ethics policy, we defined what shouldn't change all the time, which are our values. Like, how do we believe the world should look like, and specifically business should look like when it comes to our values. And we stated 6 very comprehensive values in there, like that we value human agency and oversight, that we value transparency and explainability, that we value bias freeness in the output of whatever AI model is used, as well as discrimination freeness of the output, for example. And then we took all these values and operationalized it in a way that even already early when somebody has an idea down to it's running in production, we consistently check all these values. And since we did it for many, many years already, it's kind of ingrained in our standard development procedures as we work through that. And we have also since years, an AI ethics governance body, right, which is, you can find it on the web, all these very important people like our general counsel and our chief information security officer and our chief diversity and inclusion officer. And they look from all these various lenses, they look on the various use cases that are being proposed. And sometimes we also don't do things because technologically we cannot ensure the values that we've given ourselves. And as a result of that, of course, it's also here a virtuous cycle. At the beginning, things are usually manual, but if you work through them like 2, 3, 4 times, you start to recognize patterns, right, in certain domains. And then we innovate a lot, right, putting that also into technology. So for give you just one example, out of our HR solutions, which are deemed as high risk, right, according to EU AI Act, there was a lot of question like, oh, how can we do bias detection, right? How do we get not the right words into, your performance goals or your development goals or your feedback or whatever. At the beginning, it was very manual and was very tedious and so on. But now we have actually a technology component that is used underneath, where we check and reduce all these biases according to some research that we made out of teams out of Singapore in order to reduce these effects, so to speak. And we can also see these numbers and lots of experiments around that. And now it's a reuse component that we are introducing everywhere where texts are used, whether it's email generation or ticket generation or any other sorts of replies where, interaction at the end of the day with humans are involved. And so this is how we think about it, right? It always starts with the AI ethics steering. And then step by step, we also codify that knowledge, right, and the best practices into tools and technologies that help us to scale those approaches even more.
Yeah, I love that, because it starts with a strong governance framework, which is 6 principles, right? Which is a relatively limited number of principles, so you can actually implement them. Then building out components, like a modular approach to this that makes it easier to implement. But as you said, you've also been doing it for a while, and there's always a culture component too, right? And so people's approach to this changes over time. So I think that's very good advice for other people looking to figure out how to do this.
And you raise an important point, the culture part. We didn't touch on the culture part. That's exactly, I think, also that takes the longest, right? Because obviously, if you're a developer, most of our developers, to be very honest, they don't like going into this steering committee, right? And defending their case and getting all these questions like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And then it's like, oh, I thought I'm done. No, you're not done, right? There's more considerations to make. But over time, right, they adapt to it and they also incorporate those learnings early on in the product development cycle, and then it also goes easier later on.
And I think as people, you come from an engineering background, you're obviously now chief AI officer at one of the world's largest software companies. What do you think are the key skills and experiences for people that aspire to a chief AI officer role?
That's a great question. I mean, on the one hand side, of course, having a good amount of knowledge in AI is helpful, but I will say it's not the only thing you need, right? By far not. I think you can be the best AI expert in the world, but really driving that with an end-to-end lens requires a lot of other skills as well. It requires a lot of soft skills, right? Communicate clearly, understand the portfolio, understand also the dynamics in particular in SAP, understanding the large dynamics, like who is motivated and incented by what, right? So that you can really also produce the outcome. How do you really focus on customers, right? How do you describe a comprehensive strategy? How do you define from a legal and from a commercial standpoint the things in the right way? So it's really taking this 360 perspective, which requires, I think, at least a good amount of understanding of AI, but also, of finance, a little bit of legal, a little bit of sales, a little bit of just engineering, right? Because many things are just standard software engineering. So I think all these elements combined to really put the things together, right? All these various concepts, so that it end to end really makes sense from an outcome perspective to a customer. So I think if you aspire to get in such a role, you should focus also on those things that you are not yet very well rounded yet with, so to speak, right? Because for the AI things, you will have people, right? I have people who are much better in AI than I am, right? But in order to bring these things, still a decent amount of knowledge helps, right? To steer it in the right way. So I think it's really a combination of many, many skills you have to have in order to be successful in that role.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think as with any leadership role, it takes those soft skills, the collaboration skills. But I think AI in particular, given how just deeply embedded it will be throughout the organization, is going to be one of those things where that becomes even more important than
it
some
becomes
of the
even
other
more important
leadership
because it's
roles.
so pervasive. Absolutely.
It's so pervasive. Yeah. I mean, Philipp, I could talk to you all day. This is so interesting to me. One final question for leaders that are looking to bring AI into their organizations. What advice would you give them?
First of all, start, right? And because I still see, to be honest, many customers, surprisingly, who have not made up their mind yet on where they like to go. Of course, many experiment, right? And obviously, we always talk to many who do already, but also there are still plenty of organizations I see, right, who they are kind of in a waiting mode, I feel, right, and in which direction that develops. And I think overall, organizations should just get started, because it's very clear it won't go away. This topic won't go away anymore. It's very clear, so obvious, and then really also focus on learning the basic principles, right? Helping their employees to explore that topic, right, and to learn it. Because the reality is also, I just saw a recent study somewhere, right, that even if the people, they are not, for example, from an official policy perspective, allow, I don't know, the use of chat GPT or whatsoever, people anyway, they will find ways. They will find ways using it. Overall, what I see is it's really a bottom-up movement in organizations. And I think in particular leaders, and this is what I encourage everyone, is to empower, right, the organizations to run their own experiments, to fail, of course, fail fast, to then really come up with the right strategy on how AI fits into their organization.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Start, because it's not going away. Educate your workforce and empower them to deliver on use cases. Philipp, thank you so much for your time today. If people want to follow your work and what you do, where should they go?
I think LinkedIn is best.
Okay, that's Philipp Herzig from SAP. Go follow him on LinkedIn. Send him a direct message if you listened to this episode and enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.